talking about going live with Ryan. Don't worry. I'm not going to hit sound effects this time.
No, wah wah wah.
No, because I'm currently experiencing what you might call plumbing work at my house.
Are you in a pastor's office right now?
Oh yeah. They have a drill going through the floor at my house. Our new home, first home my family has purchased, because academics delay doing such things until they get a real job, and then that didn't work out. So, we discovered that the house we bought has completely corroded pipes underneath it, and you have to drill out the floor to replace them. So, I realized ideal place to live stream is not with a jackhammer in the background. So, started texting minister friends, and I'm like, does your internet suck at church? If not, can I come over?
That looks like that couch right there. You if you're a pastor, you have to have that couch. And those curtain things, you got to have those too. That's a law.
I understand. It's clear. Look at this. Doesn't it look like a conference room?
That looks like such a church office conference room thing.
In front of me is a wall that has 5 large paintings featuring sheep.
Oh, that's nice. I like that.
Oh yeah. And I mean, it's just like being on a train in Scotland, but different, because these are very, very clean sheep. They don't look like they live in a place of rain and dirt and wind all the time.
Can we talk about how you could just call people up and be like, hey, can I just do a live stream from your church office? And I'm like, sure, why not?
Well, I mean, I know a lot of ministers. It's a consequence of getting to hang out with you on the internet. And we're going to talk about the year in religion, Ryan.
That's what we're going to do.
Oh, yeah. Now, the preface statement, before we get into the episode, I want to show you my trailer for Experiencing God, 45 seconds of exciting things, because it's the upcoming homebrewed class, and the video people editing all these talks and stuff from beer camp into this video curriculum made a Experiencing God trailer. Now you're Baptist, I'm Baptist. What is the phrase experiencing God bring to mind when you hear
Piper? John Piper, dude, for sure.
And what was that curriculum? Who was the guy that did the curriculum Experiencing God?
Yeah, I don't know the guy. We did it in my church, so my Southern Baptist church, like 1998, I bet.
Yeah. Well, I just remembered it because both Piper and that curriculum, they love the burning bush image.
Oh yeah, that was on the cover, wasn't it?
Yeah. So that's kind of the what you need to know to enjoy this this trailer for Experiencing God. Now, feel free to enjoy your commentate, but I was thoroughly amused with this.
All right. I'm the most excited I've been all day.
I thought so. I mean, it's early in the day, so hopefully this isn't the peak, but
put off thy shoes from off thy feet.
Have you ever struggled with your experience of God?
Stand up. Get the hell out.
We're kidding. This January, come through for a 4-week boot camp on divine encounters within the human experience. It's basically the online version of Theology Beer Camp, hosted by Tripp Fuller, with a little less karaoke.
What am I singing?
You'll get access to 11 super solid lectures, live Q&A sessions with some cool people talking with their hands. Oh, it looks like Dan Koch's going to be there. Access to a private online community and a collection of helpful online resources.
This is just some of what we'll explore together.
The background, like
Sign up at experiencingGod.net. It won't be the same without you.
Can I just say I think you and Dan Koch are the same person in my mind?
will let you know that you're not the only person who has suggested such.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like I know you both. Like I met Dan in person in Denver at AAR. Like I know you're different people, but in my head it's like you gonna get mooshed together somehow. I don't know.
It does good for his reputation because I just I have to really like help him out. Like, look, I'm
Hey,
nice and extroverted and outgoing and jovial and Dan is just too cool sometimes to really be like a cheerleader and encouraging. And sometimes I think he just gets partial credit for all the joy I bring.
listen, Dan brings one-on-one joy. You bring like 1,000 person joy. They're different.
Yeah, well, I want to bring you joy right now. That's what I'm going to do. So, for people that haven't joined previously or listened to other episodes with Ryan,
Yeah.
well, this is a great first one because he is a professional graph maker using data for religion and such in America, rocks the graphs on Twitter every day. And you know what Twitter is? The
bird site.
Yeah, well, it's the public square. It's the frontier of democracy. And so today, in looking at the past year, what are the 5 pieces of data that are the most popular by the world's greatest public square full of democracy and freedom? Well, that's Twitter. So the the graphs we're looking at today are
Oh, you see that Elon said that Kevin McCarthy should be speaker this morning? Like, who gives a flying crap what Elon Musk thinks about congressional politics? Like, good God.
um I have sweeping judgments towards people that do care what he thinks about congressional politics, but I don't know if that's going to be one of these
It's
charts. Oh, okay.
dang.
But now before we look at them, is there anything in the past year, like if we were talking a year ago,
Yeah.
is there anything in the kind of interest and questions the public square is asking around the intersections of religion, culture, politics, and such that you wouldn't have anticipated being so front of mind?
I think like fertility stuff has become like front of mind. I know we talked about this like 2 times ago, and I got a bunch of trouble talking about it. And maybe I'm helping drive the conversation. I don't know. But like when you see numbers from like, Southeast Asia, like Japan and South Korea, how like they're below replacement level fertility, that became like a story, like in the American context too. And then we're talking a lot more about marriage and family and, just like different ways of doing life. I think that's something that really kind of cropped up in 2022. A lot of people thought, what am I doing? Am I having kids? Am I getting married? Why am I not having kids? Why am I not getting married? Like those are important questions. I think a lot of people like in our age range, especially like late 20s through your 30s, start thinking like, what I should probably like grow up and become an adult now, not to get like Mark Driscoll on you or anything, but like I should like start thinking about going through life stages. And I think coming out of the pandemic, I think a lot of people thought like, shouldn't I get back on track now? Didn't I just lose 2 years of like the life course? And I think that's what a lot of stuff I'll talk about today, but also just talking about online is like fertility stuff, having kids, being married. I love all that kind of discourse, by the way.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that when we get to one of those slides, you will edify us, and there's a high likelihood
to get in trouble. That's what you're trying to say right now, Tripp.
Look, this is a year in religion, a nerdy party with charts and data. I didn't use the phrase hot take in it just in case, you don't want to get yourself in trouble again with all of your anti-natalist screeding.
I will try to tone down the anti-natalism discussion today.
We'll see. Oh, I mean, not so much down, because some people enjoy, sharpening iron with iron, Ryan. Like that's why Twitter is invented, for wonderful discourse, human communication at its peak. And now, when you sent these to me, I put them in the order.
Yeah.
Is this how does this work? Is it the most popular to least, or least to of the top 5?
Show me the first one, and I'll tell you which one it is.
All right,
because I know the most popular one. Oh, that's the most popular one right there,
all right.
Tripp.
Okay, I'm going to turn off our lights here on the screen because it impacts. But it was festive for a second, wasn't it?
It looks super good.
Yeah. All right. The religious affiliation of 18 to 35-year-olds in 87% of people aged 18 to 35 years old were Christians. 8% identified as religiously unaffiliated. By 98, 73% of young people were Christians. And 21% of young people identified as nuns. America lost its religion in the 1990s.
Cue Michael Stipe. You know, like a little mandolin. That's got to be like one of the very few songs that has a mandolin intro that like got really popular, you know?
Mm-hmm. You have to be cool to make a mandolin rock and roll, and REM can do that.
They did. Automatic for the people. Yeah, I think this is like the graph that I want to turn into something else. Hopefully like a chapter in a bigger book project on like what happened to America with religion over the last 40 or 50 years. Because I think part of what Twitter makes me do is like try to like distill things in their most like purest, most cogent form. And I think this graph does that because it's really simple. That's like one of the things I've learned being on Twitter like the last 5 years and making like 5,000 graphs is the ones that tend to take off are the simplest ones. Like don't put like 50 lines and don't put like a bunch of facets and stuff. 2 lines, a little annotated box, a really straightforward message, like a nuance does not do well on the Burge site. I know you're shocked by that. So you want it to be very simple. And this one's really simple. It's just the idea that like between 1991 and 1998, the share of young people who are not religious jumped 12 points in 8 years, 7, 8 years. And the share of Christians dropped 14 points during the same time period. That's insane. Like religious demography doesn't work that way. I mean, if you lose like a point or two in a year, that's a big deal. And you know, we're talking 12 points and 14 points in like 7 years. And I think you know, we are living in the aftermath of this early 1990s period because a lot of these people now are raising children, you know, and those children are in their teen years and moving into their adulthood years, you know, like college aged. And you inherit, whether you like it or not, the religion of your parents. And that's actually the biggest determinant of your current religion is the religion of your household that you grew up in. So whenever you see this many people lose religion in the 1990s, their children are now not religious because of what happened to their parents 35 years ago. And I think that's incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. I know in your larger work, there's or in the field, there's a lot of arguing around what were the variables or events or changing cultural situation that generated this radical change. Are there a few a few of those variables that you think, oh, if we were asking and polling people that attend to this, what are the variables they consider really important? And are there any that they go, look, I know culturally we say these things, but that probably isn't the energizing element.
Yeah. So one that I think about that's kind of like in the background of everything that no one really talks about a lot is the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991. And communism was basically over, you know, by 1991, 1992. And if you remember, like look back in American history, like in the 50s, like atheists and communism were like interlinked together, right? To be non-religious was to be a Russian, was to be Chinese, was to be an anti-American individual. We put in God we trust in our money in the 1950s. We put under God in the pledge in the 1950s. It was basically a way to inoculate us against communism. So we kind of fused together religious belief and democracy, Western democracy. And when the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR broke up, I think a lot of people go, I can be an atheist now because it doesn't mean to be a communist because there's really not any communists that we're fighting against anymore. So it sort of gave like tacit permission for a lot of people to go, okay, I can say I'm a nun now. So I think that's one part of it, right? Is just the idea that like that fusion began to weaken to such a level that it didn't matter as much anymore. The second thing is that
Can I ask one follow-up about that?
Go ahead.
Is part of that, like if we're thinking sociologically, is part of that at that point in the 50s and then the children raised in it, your religious identity and your identity as an American, your identity as a worker in a capitalist economic system, all of them were so entwined because the opposite of that is right. The other power post World War II, the other economic model and a communist state, and the other kind of largely religious, option of like, oh, they're materialist atheists, because Or is that something people kind of point out, that those three kind of like twisted together?
I think what happened was in the 50s, 60s, everything the Russians are, we aren't. You know what I mean? Like, so they're communists, we're capitalists. You are materialistic, we're not materialistic, right? You are atheist, we are not. So whatever you are, we chose the opposite thing of you. And one of my favorite quotes, and a lot of people don't think about this, like in the 50s, we think we were really religious. We weren't really religious. We were just really religiously minded in terms of like, you had to be religious. Harry Truman said, I want people to be religious. I just don't care what it is. So it's like this generic like religiosity is sort of like an antidote or an inoculation against, the Red Scare and all those kind of things. So that's the way Americans were in the 50s. We had this like idyllic idea they were all evangelicals or whatever. Like that wasn't it. It was like I'm a generic Christian. I'm a Methodist. I'm a Episcopalian. I'm a Presbyterian. I probably go once a month.
They're Protestants. They're Protestants,
just a generic
right? We're
Protestant.
rebranding.
Oh, that's right. My bad. The main line is Protestants, and those other people are Christians. But like that's how we were. We were just generically Protestant. Most of us were Protestant, by the way, not evangelical in those days. I think 50% of Americans in the 1950s were mainline. Right. Now it's 10%. And so 50% were mainline. Probably 20% were evangelical. So that was the flavor of Christianity in America, was that moderate sort of and I think that actually helped inoculate anymore, because it wasn't like we were like diehard. We were just like, I'm not an atheist. I go to my Methodist church twice a year, and that's cool. Like that's enough to stop it from happening. So I think that's a big part of it, but I think we cannot discount the role of politics. And this is something that like we've been talking about in the academic literature for like 20 years now. Houghton Fisher wrote this great piece in 2002, like, why are people leaving religion? Politics. Like they kind of just like keyed in on this idea that liberals leave religion much more rapidly than conservatives do. And if you think about what happened in the 1990s, think about this. If you look back at like the Reagan era, like Tip O'Neill was the speaker. He's a Democratic speaker. He and Reagan actually like golfed together and stuff. They hung out. Like they did not hate each other. Reagan was to the right, but not far to the right, especially in terms of like the modern GOP. He'd actually probably be a leftist in the modern GOP. But people got along then, and you did not look at the person across the aisle and say they're evil, they're bad, yada, yada, yada. And then, what happened in like 1994, Newt Gingrich got elected. And Newt Gingrich got elected by being a bomb thrower, right? Newt Gingrich got elected by saying the Democrats are evil. And if you elect them, the country's going to fall apart. And as soon as that rhetoric kicked up, other people joined in with the Newt Gingrich rhetoric. And then, the Democrats did in response. They started using the same rhetoric against the Republicans. And so it created this polarization where people felt like they had to make a choice. And that's to me, that's when the God gap started, right? To be a Democrat is to be less religious. To be a Republican is to be more religious. And I think that kind of that little fissure just kind of continued to expand over the last 30 years now. And here's an amazing statistic. Today, 50% of white Democrats are nuns, atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. Half of white Democrats are nuns now. And I think that's the kind of evidence of the God gap, right? To be religious is to be Republican, to be non-religious is to be a Democrat, especially amongst white people. And I think a lot of that started, I want to blame Newt Gingrich because that dude sucks. And he kind of poisoned the well for politics. And then from there, you've got, your Tom DeLays. And you can draw a straight line from Tom DeLay to, Donald Trump. I think all those things sort of follow logically from each other, which is that I push it to the right. Now you push it to the next, and you push it to the next, and you push it to the next. And I think logically that ends where we are right now with no Speaker of the House, because the freaking Republican Party has 20 nutbags who are so far right, they want to burn the whole thing down, as opposed to electing a speaker who's really conservative, but not conservative enough. I think you can trace a lot of that back to the early 1990s, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah. It is funny when in this current situation, when Newt Gingrich starts lecturing, be like, can't you just take the win? They're destroying our, they should take the win and govern, and you're like, all right. But, it's like Barry Bonds being the one that's like a stickler for cheating.
Yeah. Do it right, guys.
You're right. Come on. Like,
yeah.
Look, when I cheated, we got better attendance and made more money. This is ridiculous.
Well, that's the thought. Like, Newt Gingrich is honestly the worst person on earth. Like, he's in the top 10. Because he sits around and acts like he's like all above this stuff. I'm like, you're the reason that you gave permission for these idiots to do this stuff. The politics of division is what you ran on, Chief. And look, you're getting it exactly. This is the logical conclusion of the politics of division. You started this. And the problem is now the Democrats, that's always the problem. If they go here, where do we go? Do we go high or do they go low? Because the Republican Party is basically showing that we will use whatever rule we can to get what we want. Ruth Bader Ginsburg dies. Probably shouldn't have appointed a new member of the Supreme Court until we had a new election. Screw that. We put someone in there, right? And I think that's the problem is if they go low, do we go lower or do we go high? That's really the big question, not to go off too far afield. That's the big question to me in American politics right now is that the other party has shown that it will just do whatever it takes to win. What do you do in response?
Yeah. Yeah. So you were about to throw out a second variable.
Yeah.
And I asked a follow-up question. So
yeah. So I think politics and communism were like kind of like two overarching things. There's one that I want to talk about just a minute that I think a lot of people think is such a big deal, but I don't know if it's such a big deal, which is the internet. It's impossible for us to like quantify what impact I've tried. Like I've looked at different data. The problem with the internet is it got adopted so rapidly by a huge swath of America in like a 3 or 4 year period that you can't really figure out how it impacted individuals because everyone jumped on board. So you don't have the control group. You know what I mean? You only have the treatment group, which is I got home internet. You don't have a whole lot of I didn't have. And by the way, the people who did not get home internet by like 2002 are probably a bunch of weirdos to begin with, right? Like in terms of like, they're probably a bunch of fundamentalist Christians. So like that skews your sample too, right? So that's the problem with like the internet seems right. You know, like in my head, I'm like, yeah, the internet has to drive some of this religious disaffiliation. And I think it has and it will, but to actually quantify the level of that, I just can't do that. So the data is not there. I think theoretically it's there. I don't think the data is there. And I think it's impossible. Like I was even reading a book about YouTube. It's called Like, Comment, Subscribe is the name of the book, which is a great title.
We talk about how smashing the like button. Does it discuss how you smash
that like, hit that bell so you get the first notification? But like they were talking about how the new atheist movement really got a lot of traction on YouTube like 10 years ago and attracted a lot of young people. Like I would love to be able to track like YouTube viewing and religious disaffiliation. I think for a lot of young people that actually they saw Harris and Hitchens and Dawkins on these videos and that drove them away from religion. I would love to see how that works, but that's really, really hard to like nail down methodologically, like in a scientific way. So it seems right, but I just can't prove it, from a data standpoint.
Well, as someone who was a youth minister in that period of time, I like regularly had students look stuff up on YouTube and then have some, scholar and whatever the discipline that's related to it. They watched a few videos and then come in and are like, I don't even know if I could believe in God or, something about biblical history or, all that kind of stuff. And, really affirming a metaphysical deity and history, not necessary at the UCC. Right. But okay, that was a high quality joke. But if you didn't have a philosophy of religion PhD student as your youth minister, like who's like actually the entire chapters on the proofs for God's existence and Richard Dawkins' books are just wrong. At articulating Aquinas, I was like, I'm a process. I'm not even into that. But I just like once it's factually wrong as a poor description. And most of the new atheists actually just don't know what the concept of God means for a Western monotheist. So then when they dismiss it, like it's just uninformed. And that's unrelated to whether or not they're good at biology or neurobiology or other things. It's just, you kind of have to know what you're rejecting to reject it intellectually. I think they're rejecting it emotionally, culturally, right? Thinking after 9/11 and all that kind of stuff. And so I would explain stuff and they're like, oh, okay. But why I thought of that is, and you may know more about this than me, is that the whole kind of, so the way normative ideas function sociologically change when the spectrum of possibility for those you encounter with authority changes. And so if I was trying to think through like what would be the way, say the YouTube example or the internet changes it, is these young adults who are growing up in a UCC congregation. So, and they actually come to youth group, which probably means they actually care about their faith more than most other liberal Protestant youth, they still came in and had questions that um, if if you had the wrong youth minister, then the way plausible answers function sociologically are going to proliferate because you got all these contesting authorities, and then any intuition you have or experience that leads you to one place, it's now a live option. And I think for most of Christendom, whatever the live options were, like the options for like thoughtful living in the world were just so much narrower that like yes, we haven't like secularized, but we have got to the point culturally where the each individual has a much anxiety-inducing task before them because the plausibility structures around are huge, and they could be thoughtful and intelligent and all that kind of stuff, which is real different. I think that the internet made the contact of a multiplicity of difference intensify quickly. That would be like the thing I could think of. Just that's what came to mind, at least when you told the YouTube reference.
Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot, by the way. Like, atheists are really good online. Like, they're very compelling. Like Dawkins and Hitchens. I mean, I know what they say a lot of times is wrong, but they do it in a very like attractive way, like a very compelling, interesting way. And I think, see, here's the problem. I was thinking if I was growing up like in 2012, right? Like like I was a lot younger than I am right now, 20 years younger. I would watch those videos and go like, wow, man, Dawkins is really interesting. Like, he makes a lot of good points because he's really charismatic. The problem is, then I would go, okay, but what is the other side? And what does that look like on YouTube? And it sucks on YouTube. Because I feel like everyone on the other side, here's what my 20-year-old cynical
You're saying
brain,
Ken Ham isn't persuasive?
Exactly right. That's exactly. But I'm not just Ken Ham, Piper, like all these thinkers, I would watch that and go, of course you believe that stuff because you're a pastor. Like, give me a more like objective other view of it than you. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's where I would struggle. And I think like that's a space where like I think a lot of Christians missed is like the counter argument, the apologetics argument is let's get my pastor up there and tell you why, let's do the case for Christ with Lee Strobel and all that crap. Like, that's not it, man. That doesn't convince anyone that Dawkins is wrong. You need someone from a different perspective, like who has less skin in the game to say like, but wait, here's why God exists, or here's why I believe these things, and not from a pastor or a theologian, from like somebody else. And the internet doesn't really provide that very much, I don't feel like.
Yeah, and I think it's because most of those figures were intellectuals of some sort that culturally we treat those a reductive materialist position as value neutral when it's not. But yeah, anyway, that we don't need to derail because we've only done one slide. And
real quick,
don't worry.
God,
this one, I'm sure.
This is going to get me in so much trouble. Good God.
Are you the parent or guardian of any children under the age of 18? The drop in fertility over the last decade is primarily among Democrats. Peak parenting in 2010. Though I have to say, I might prefer parenting in 2010 right now. But 65% of Republicans in their late 30s were parents. 62% Democrat. Peak parenting in 2020. 60% of Republicans in their late 30s were parents, 50% of Democrats.
Yeah, man, peak parenting is way down. Like, so the question is really, it's an odd one because it asks, like, are you currently the parent or guardian of a child under the age of 18? Right. So, like, do you have kids at home is basically what the question's asking. So it's incredibly age dependent. Right. So late 30s is when you're the most likely to say yes to that question. And it's really interesting that in your late 30s today, a Democrat in their late 30s, half of them are parents and half of them are not. Now, that doesn't mean that half of Democrats never have kids, but it doesn't mean that a whole lot of that means a huge chunk of Democrats never have kids. Probably about 40% of Democrats never have children. And for Republicans, it's much higher than that. It's probably at least, 55, 60% of Republicans are parents in their late 30s, which means it's probably 70% of Republicans overall have kids. So there's this huge partisan gap. And this is something I think about a lot more recently, which is the idea that partisanship is everything. Like, it even predicts, like, are you going to make babies or not? And the data says that Democrats just don't make babies at the same rate that Republicans do. Actually, I tweeted a graph about this last night. I even compared like Protestants to Protestants and Catholics to Catholics, and even atheists, like Republican atheists to Democrat atheists. Republican atheists have more children than Democrat atheists do. The only time the partisan gap goes away is when we look at Catholics. Democratic Catholics and Republican Catholics have kids at the same rate. Protestants, Republicans have more kids. Other religions, Mormons, Buddhists, Republicans have more kids than Democrats. And I think that's something really we need to think about a lot, is why are Democrats not having children even when you control for religion?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you know individuals, the fascinating thing is it's easy to hear and understand most individuals' decision-making process. And then when you look at the data on the macro, then and you ask yourself, do these communities I have a deep resonance with, would we as a collective want to make these kind of decisions? That's a different thing. And I know one of the other elements, just in the later you have children, you're more likely to have fewer.
Correct.
If you understand the impact of just the influence of your primary, like your nuclear family and initial community and stuff, then one of the things I think about when looking at this is how does the lower birth rate among people that are, Protestant versus evangelical, Democrat versus Republican and stuff change the shape of the kind of data you would track in 30 years, right?
Yeah.
So if most of my peers that are liberal Protestant regretfully supporting a corporatist Democrat until someone with a thorough criticism of the free market emerges. Like most of my peers don't have kids or have one. I have three because I had that legacy of being a Baptist preacher's kid and you had to get married to have sex. So, but when you look at these, how does that change the way we even think about future generations, knowing that such a higher percentage of the kids are going to be born to more conservative religion and political context?
You got to convert. It's convert or die. Like that's the way the Democratic Party has to survive in America now, is because, to be completely blunt, the Republicans are outbreeding them. Like that's just a fact. Now we do know that people tend to, become more, young people, just because you're raised Republican doesn't mean you stay Republican. A lot of them become Democrats over time. But man, you're working from behind every single day. And that's the problem, is like demography is, I know this is not like a great replacement theory thing. So don't hear me incorrectly on this. Okay. Demographics are destiny. You know what I mean? And at some level, you're facing an uphill battle every day as Democrats, and that you have to convert more and more people. Republicans just have to retain their own people. That's one of the reasons the Latter-day Saints are actually doing fairly well, is because they have a crap ton of kids, and even if you lose a bunch of them, you still have a ton to work with to begin with, right? So you got more draws from the pile every time. That's the problem, is if you draw from the pile fewer and fewer times, you can't lose anybody.
And the ones you keep are the ones that are going to have the most grandkids for you.
That's exactly right. But it's at some point, like you have 12 kids, and even like if a third of them leave, you still got a bunch of kids in your church. If you have 2 kids or 3 kids and a third of them leave, you only have 2 left. You know what I mean? So like at some level, we got to start talking about fertility as an idea. Like I'm amazed, like what, like, Liz Bruning wrote a piece about how she had kids young, and she got married young and had kids young, in like the New York Times. Everyone lost their friggin' mind. Like that to me is like blows my mind. Like the idea of like getting married at 25 and having 2 kids by your 32nd birthday. By the way, most Democrats, you know what the age is when most Democrats are married or have been married at least once? 32. For Republicans, it's 27. So half of Democrats on their 32nd birthday have never been married. Half. So, they're even delaying that part of life. So, I mean, I get if you don't want to have kids because of the costs and the time, I understand that. But like, in some ways, it feels like Democrats are saying like every institution that's existed. I sound like such a freaking evangelical right now. Every institution that's existed in all of human history with marriage and family, a lot of Democrats are looking at that and going, nope, we don't want to do that. And if you want to make that philosophical choice, that
Yeah.
is your choice. But it does have tremendous ramifications for the future of not just your life, but like you said, Tripp, the macro level shifts in American culture. That's something that your decision is not just your decision, it radiates into the larger culture. And I think that's what we need to think about. It's not just me, but us and we. And I think that's Democrats
Yeah.
are typically good at that, at collective thinking. But
Mhm.
here it doesn't seem like they are as good at that. I don't know.
I think that dynamic, I've heard pointed out by some of my conservative friends since moving back to North Carolina. They're like, they are aware of this data, and they're like, yeah, and that's why we're all hung up on public schools and higher ed, because um like when is it that our kids break rank? It's stuff they learn in public school being forced into context of diversity, where the majority of the people around them minimize and dismiss our family's deep values. And I'm like, well, there might be a good reason. But and then they go to college, and this kind of thing. Now, the there is a um uh like, being aware of that, I think helps recognize why both sides have this high investment on, like, what is the normative formation for a citizen,
Mm-hmm.
and if the output of it is something that, you know the consequences threaten something that, for you as a conservative religious person, is your deepest, most cherished values that you hope to hand on to your kids. Like, even though I disagree, I think there can be a kind of um, cognitive form of empathy where you understand where these tensions come from.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't call it value neutral when we know what the consequences of this kind of education is.
Yeah.
Now, personally, I'm rather supportive of it, but I do think that, like, developing a kind of an empathy that's not so much like, oh, feel their feels, but being able to think how they understand it from their perspective will enable a kind of understanding, if we're hoping to move beyond uh, the kind of flame throwing that exists in.
Oh, can I make a suggestion for your listener, which are obviously left of center? I would guess most of Tripp's folks are to the left. Every once in a
There are
while,
people that hate listen.
yeah, well, go look at like libs of TikTok on Twitter. Like that's an account that's got like several million views, and all they do is like post the most nutbag left people on TikTok. They pull the clips and put them on Twitter, and basically make fun of them. Now, is 90% of that bizarre and stupid and like counterproductive? Yeah. But I think at some level, you need to see the worst of your own side, right? Like the most extreme version of you. You need to see that and realize what the other side doesn't like about you, because they're seeing you as that, if you get what I'm saying. Like, do some oppo research on your own team, because there's tons of accounts that talk about how, like, fundamentalist preachers saying dumb stuff, and like Right Wing Watch and all that. There's tons of websites that do that on the right. You need to do, instead of just following all those accounts and making fun of your conservative friends for how nutbag that one person was on their Twitter account, you need to follow, like, look at the other side and the oppo research they're doing to realize there's nutty people in your camp too, and you need to be willing to call those people out. Like, I think that's part of the like the school discussion. There are teachers who are trying to teach kids, and there are not many of them, don't get me wrong, but that whiteness is bad. You know what I mean? Like, have guilt for whiteness, and talking about, 7-year-olds about colonialism and stuff. Like, they're not ready for that cognitively. So I think we need to be aware that, like, there are people on both sides that are doing really harmful things to our children in the school system. And it's just as bad when the far left does it as the far right, in my estimation, at least. The far left and the far right, we gotta understand that, like, there's a reason why the right is scared of the left. They're not just making up boogeymen. Well, they are, but we do the same thing with the other side too. We make up boogeymen on the other side and get mad at them. So I try my best, and like you said, Tripp, empathize with the other position and really inhabit the other position. Think about it the way they think about it, not just like straw man it up, but really consider it. And sometimes I can't get there. I'm like, you're just nuts. Like, you're just making stuff up. and you're just like wanting to be angry. But sometimes I'm like, yeah, you might have an idea of a point there, and I track with you. And I think there's a lot of value in trying to do that.
Mhm. Yeah, well, it's it's a dangerous thing to do, and I think it's true. It is more difficult to do that if um, if the conversations take place in a public space where the expectations are reifying your tribal identity and requesting or demanding or shaming people into purity. So it and that happens on the internet, encourages that from all sorts of locations. Um, so the I think that is a problem that is unique to our space, is how much of the public square is overdetermined by people thinking out loud in uh you know in the terms the technology generates.
Mm.
And in one of the other parts that's difficult, is the issues or seem to be really asymmetrical, right? Like, I've had this conversation where you're sitting there and you're thinking, how I if we were just to gauge the level of the cray cray,
Mm-hmm.
like it's asymmetrical. Like if you just think back
Mm.
to the trajectory from Newt Gingrich on, and so
Mm.
many times people on the progressive side, like even if you want to you want to acknowledge it, you want to be clear and all that kind of stuff, you're like, yeah, but like this is like a level 3 violation. And
Yes.
you call moderate a level 6? Like, oh, the moderates in the House. I mean, yes, they all of them voted not to certify the election. But did they rally people to the cap? No. No. No, they just gave them a big fist bump and retweeted a few. Maybe they used some campaign funds to give them there. A few of them may have given tours to the people the day before, but you know what I mean. I mean, they didn't personally hit a cop.
Mhm.
I feel like um one of the difficulties is how hard that is to uh, to get over. You're like it's kind of like in a marriage where where you're sitting with the counselor and they're kind of like, yeah, well, have you thought about apologizing? You're like, well, thought about it. Yeah, actually, like I have one prepared
Yeah.
right after
Yeah.
they go.
Yeah. By the way, I'm getting the comments are interesting about colonialism. That's such an like, like I agree. We are not. I was growing. The Pilgrims are awesome, right? Like the idea of like, yay, we're celebrating Thanksgiving because the Pilgrims came and stole a bunch of land. We didn't talk about how they stole the land from Native Americans and then diseased them with blankets and committed genocide against them.
Yeah, I
I don't
learned
know
that
when the
from
right.
South Park.
Yeah, well, I don't know when the right age to tell kids are like that white people came to America and killed a bunch of black and brown people. But we need to do that more without a shadow of a doubt. There's no doubt in my mind. I don't know what the appropriate age for that though is because I don't have a degree in early childhood education, but I do have kids,
Yeah.
and like it's hard to understand concepts like colonialism as 16-year-olds. It's hard to understand concepts like colonialism and ethnography and things like that. So like I am not opposed to teaching. I think there's a way to teach history in a more balanced way at a younger age, but we can't get into these like higher level concepts of colonialism and chattel slavery until we move on past can I multiply 6 times 4. Like
But
that's
do you
where
think
that's
part of it is like even the way you put it, like, oh, I don't know when,
yeah.
right? That assumes that we have to have a different way of engaging it because like no, that's not the way we normally ask questions around education in the public square. It's like we
Mhm.
fight about the issues that are connected to cultural identities and enforcing the narratives we want told. And like I mean, at least my experience with lots of public educators is they take their vocation seriously and would like to be driven by data and thinking about philosophy of education and how
Yeah.
psychological development and all that kind of stuff. And it is like once you like locate a fight and go for it, then um, it's hard to trust any expert to come in and help frame things.
Oh,
It's but
yeah.
uh,
I mean,
I
we can talk about that forever. I can talk about
I know.
education forever. I mean, it's whatever.
Well,
Oh, this is a good one, Tripp. You'll like this one, bud.
I will.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
Mean political ideology by birth cohort.
Birth cohort. We break people down into 5-year birth cohorts.
Yeah, because they were like in preschool together, just
Yeah,
chilling.
we kind of said that they went through the world together. Like they saw the same
Mhm.
things with the same eyes, kind of the same developmental stage, and that is really important.
So, do people become more conservative as they age? This data tells a nuanced story. For those born between 1930 and 1949, they did move rightward between 2008 and 2021.
Mm-hmm.
1950 to 1964 saw no change at all. Those born after 65 or later have moved to the left between 2008 and 2021.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's this theory, like in political science, that as people age, they get more conservative, politically conservative, actually culturally conservative too. You get right down to it. So as people, grow up, you think about like your parents, like when they were 40 versus 60, like they watch a lot more Fox News now or whatever. So what's really like that's a really hard question to test because you have to have a really big data set to be able to do that. And we've only got those in the last like 10 or 12 years. So this is like the first one we have. This is the cooperative election study, which has like 30,000 people a year, which means we can break it down into birth cohorts and still have a lot of people in our sample. And what you find is like older Americans, like pre-World War II Americans, like up to the 1945 cohort, they have become more conservative over the last, 10 or 12 years. But then if you look down at that like 1950 row and then over, like those are like peak boomers. Like my parents are born in that 50, 54 cohort. Like those lines are basically flat, which means they are just where they are today, which by the way, on a scale from 1 to 5, they're like a 3.25. So like literally like a quarter click to the right of center. So slightly right of center is where they are. And then, but if you look at like the cohorts, especially like into the 70s and 80s, what you're seeing is those cohorts are becoming more liberal as time passes. So like the impact of aging is not the same based on when you were born. For older people, more conservative. For like people in their 60s, it's sort of flatline, no change. And for younger people, those like 70s and later, it's moving to the left, which is really, really noteworthy because that means millennials, this is primary millennials and younger generation X are actually becoming more liberal as they age, which has like huge impacts on electoral politics because those are the kind of people who are like voting in huge numbers now. Like Gen X and millennials are really going to be running electoral politics in this country in the next 10 or 15 years, and they become more liberal over time, which means the Democrats should, in air quotes, theoretically do better because of that.
Yeah, I mean, what that shift though, what do you like? What are the possible initiating variables?
That's a good question. I think a lot of like there's a huge narrative online like the boomers have screwed us. I think you've probably
Oh,
seen that.
seen it. I'm I have a list of bitterness towards the boomers.
And I mean, in some ways they have, right? Because it's like they got on the lifeboat and then pulled up the ladder for everybody else. Like, well, you guys can figure it out. It'll be fine. Especially when you hear this rhetoric a lot in the context of housing. The cost of buying a home, the cost of even renting an apartment or a home has gone up astronomically in certain parts of this country, making it unattainable for people like in their late 20s and early 30s to afford housing right now. And I think for a lot of them, and then I think another piece of that is healthcare. The rising cost of health insurance in this country has said like, and wages have sort of stagnated. Okay, for middle class people, I think a part of this, actually, I think what the overarching like thing that's shaping all this is, we got screwed by globalization. Gen X and millennials got screwed by globalization because our parents used to go to high school, get a diploma, go straight to the factory, get a job that makes a solid middle class income. You can afford a new car every 5 or 6 years. You can go on vacation, a modest vacation once a year. You can afford your house. You can afford your health insurance. You can afford your life without much struggle. Our generation tried to do the same thing and realized they cannot afford anything, let alone a vacation or a new car every 5 or 6 years. They can't even afford to pay their rent payment. So I think for a lot of them, they go, wait, we need more government intervention to help us with paying for health insurance, paying for college, things, those kind of things.
So, like when you say the impact of globalization, right? But
Yeah.
the impact of globalization, this is a trigger warning that Tripp's about to sound like a Bernie bro, is deeply connected to the neoliberal consensus in like from Clinton on, right? Like Clinton meant that you no longer have a party that is deeply connected to labor, and the globalization process is kicked off by Clinton's cooperation with the Republican Party. So now you don't even have tension in it, right? And so like the moment you get back to the point, if you look at your dates here, right, like the big shift is Obama vocalizes an alternative, and then we get disappointed after the '08 crisis and stuff, who gets bailed out and things. You get the arrival of Occupy Wall Street. You get then you get the Democratic Party coordinating to get rid of genuine criticism, like presidential candidates with a critique of capital. So like I'm not surprised I like by this, but it just like if you think of globalization as if it's benign, no, it was an intentional decision by the purchasing via multinational companies of both political parties, where we get new trade agreements and all these tax loopholes, where it ultimately encourages those very jobs that were the baseline of so much of middle class life being sent over. And then it was seemed reasonable then because of the .com boom, but you've looked at the consequences of it. It seems rather at this point rather problematic. And so that cultural angst of that lack of, oh, we can give our kids will get at least as good a life as ours or better, and here's what the American dream looks like, got switched from something you get if you just work hard and get a job to then the kind of the later boomers had to put it on credit cards, their kids education and all that kind of stuff. And then once those kids start graduating, they have a higher percentage, they've doubled or tripled the amount of school debt. The where you live and how it cost has gone up. Healthcare's gone up, but the average starting salaries and things haven't kept up with inflation, and the number of opportunities for investment haven't, and things like that. So it's like I know that's how I see things, but like when you label a thing globalization and then you look at the timeline, it's in my mind, I go, I'm not surprised. I've said that the biggest threat to the integrity of our country is the impact of no real class analysis and solidarity from the political parties for working class people. And then what do you have? It's like the college educated group that runs on identity politics, and the resenting working class party that runs on identity politics, and the corporatist overlords that fund both sides. And anyway, so you see, this is what goes through Tripp's head when he looked at that graph.
Let me gently push back on that.
No. But you know, basically the big idea of the phrase globalization.
Yeah.
There what used to be a party that opposed it.
Yeah, but you can't do that. It's protectionism doesn't work, Tripp. Like it just doesn't work economically. We tried it. Trump tried it. Let's pay Maytag to keep those workers in Indiana, that Maytag plant. Remember that? Like right before he got elected or he took office. And you know what they did? They still shipped all those workers to Mexico, and they took the money and they're going to build robots with it to build Maytag washers with robots. Like that's just how it's. Here's the other part. Can I just appeal to your liberal sensibilities for a second? You know how many people globalization have lifted out of poverty in Southeast Asia? Literally hundreds of millions. Hundreds of millions of people in Southeast Asia, specifically China, now live middle-class lives they would not have access to if we didn't have a globalized economy. So we got screwed, right? The American worker got screwed. There's no doubt about that. But a lot of Chinese workers and Vietnamese workers and Laotian workers have done really, really well because of globalization.
But was that what Clinton and the Democrats said? No, they actually said it would be good for our middle class and the working class. They were lying because who were they obeying? Who are they obeying? These same
the capitalist overlords, Tripp,
that give money to their campaign and give money to the Republicans. So it technically was good for poor people. That's just because capitalism runs around with people with no options and figure out how they can extract wealth from their labor. And it helped that situation. But you
can't stop it though. Like capital's mobile, dude. It's gonna go. You know what's gonna happen? By the way, China is actually seeing offshoring now from China because they've become too uppity there. They got ideas about things like workers' rights. So you know what they're going to do? They're going to move to Vietnam or Cambodia, and then they're going to do from there, move to Central Africa. because there's no regulations there, and they're going to work those people to death because that's exactly what capital does. It goes to the cheapest place to find labor, and right now it's China, but it won't be in 5 or 10 years.
Oh, I am not going to underestimate the creativity of global capitalism to continue to find human beings that bear the divine image to exploit in order to throw the working class around the world under. In fact, I might even suggest that if there was someone, say a homeless first century Jew who was the image of the invisible God, that they would proclaim an alternative reality to this, identifying the outcasts and the nobodies as the very place of the inbreaking of said kingdom. Anyway, so look, there's whole classes at Homebrewed on how to be a Christian socialist, so don't worry.
Oh, Tripp, my brain's going to explode right now. But go ahead.
No, it is. You know, my favorite part about getting messages after you come on is
Yeah.
when Tony will make comments about who triggered the other one the most, and when he's guessing we had to hold back.
I'm
But
getting a lot more couth in my comments as I've gotten on Tripp Fuller's Homebrew Christianity podcast.
well, you know, everyone has their growing edges, Ryan. And but this next chart, number 3 chart from the past year in religion, shares saying holding an atheist or agnostic view of God.
Yeah.
In 1988, 6% of white Democrats took an atheist or agnostic position. It was 3% of non-white Democrats. In 2021, 32% of white Democrats were atheist or agnostic, and 8% of non-white Democrats. There's never really been a racial God gap for Republicans. Always under 2.
Yeah, under 2%. Yeah. I mean, I think that's like, I think when we talk about the God gap's the idea like Republicans are the party of religion and Democrats are not, which is, I know, completely oversimplified. I know someone's like, you know, I'm a religious Democrat. I know you are. There's lots of religious Democrats. It's fine. But generally speaking, the public is seeing those two things as being mutually exclusive now, which is for right or wrong. You can't change the way people think about things. Like that's just how the perception they create in their minds. Now, this, I think we have to chop it. Okay. First is, when it comes to the God gap, it's not just Democrats, not all Democrats. Okay. This is something we gloss over. And it's something I'm trying to get better with because I'm a white guy. And so I see things from a white guy perspective. I try not to, and I'm trying to be more cognizant of my own biases, but we need to talk a lot more about non-white Christians in this country, and non-white, you know, people of faith in this country. So we talk about the God gap. The God gap is really white Democrats versus everyone else. Non-white Democrats, when it comes to belief in God, look exactly like Republicans. And so it's white Democrats are the outliers. They're the ones who are leaving religion. Like I just talked about a couple minutes ago, half of white Democrats today in America are non-religious. That's easily the highest level of any subgroup, racial and political, right? And so I think that's what we're seeing is we're seeing the unique level of white Democrats driving the discourse around the God gap in this country, when really we should talk a lot more about non-white Democrats who are incredibly religiously devout, lots of them. But that also creates and I talk about this a lot, it creates a ton of problems for the modern Democratic Party, because you have to kind of corral white liberal atheists with black Protestants and Hispanic Catholics who on cultural issues could not be any more different than that. Like, I mean, on things like transgender and gay rights and things like that, you know, your liberal atheists, your white liberal atheists are incredibly different than your black Protestant church ladies. And I think the Democratic Party has a real problem going forward trying to keep the white nuns happy, NONES, white nuns happy, but also keeping like the non-white religious people happy, Muslims and Buddhists and Hispanic Catholics and all those kind of groups, because they do not see the world in the same way. I think that's actually I think they have a harder problem going forward than the Republicans do. The Republicans have to just they got to keep white Christianity like going, which is not going to be easy because it's declining.
Yeah.
But that's an easier problem messaging wise than trying to keep all those disparate groups under one tent. I don't know how they're going to do it, to be honest with you.
Yeah. I believe this was the follow-up. Tweet on it that I think will help, because it's the political positions of different religious groups.
Mm-hmm.
And the black Protestants are more Democrat, less liberal. Atheists are more liberal, a little less Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And so the like how does the kind of fine tune looking at the data, looking at the different kinds of religious groups, and like the different demographic parts, problematize some of the easy stories that kind of frame American religion and politics in the macro?
Oh, I think black Protestants are such an enigma. And I don't think the media writes about them very much because they have such a hard time kind of wrapping their arms around them. You almost need someone who grew up in that tradition to write about that tradition from an insider's perspective, right? Because I grew up white evangelical, now I'm white mainline. Like I do not understand the black church the way that someone who grew up in an AME church would understand its own culture because they vote overwhelmingly for Democrats. Like 90% of black Protestants voted for Joe Biden, which is like the most unified religious group in America today are black Protestants when it comes to the voting booth. However, a plurality of them call themselves moderates. Like 43% of them say they're moderate on, conservative, moderate, liberal. So, it's this, they're not, we, in their mind, I guess in our minds, we think if you vote for Biden, you've got to be liberal. A lot of black Protestants vote for Biden because they don't like Republicans. So they're Democrats, but they're moderate Democrats. And then atheists are really interesting because I love this question. It asks people to put themselves in ideological space between 1 and 7, and then put the Democrats and the Republicans in ideological space between 1 and 7. The average atheist has seen themselves go to the left over the last 5 years, and they've seen the Democratic Party go to the right over the last 5 years. So they've actually seen the Democratic Party they believe the Democratic Party has become more moderate and they're more liberal than the average Democrat now. The black Protestant looks at that and goes, wait a minute, I don't want the Democratic Party to become more liberal. I want them to become more moderate. So like the Democratic Party is in this terrible position where if it wants to win the atheist agnostics, it needs to move further left. If it wants to win the black Protestants, it's got to move farther right. You can't do those two things at the same time. It just doesn't work that way. So I think the black Protestant church presents as really interesting because, by the way, on issues like gay marriage and transgender, they're actually really conservative. The share of black Protestants with the Bible is literally true is the same as white evangelicals. So like there's this weird juxtaposition of like they're not socially liberal. They're socially moderate-ish. Now, economically, they're liberal, right? On the issues of like taxation, regulation, things like that, they're liberal. But on these other issues, they're middle of the road. And I think, by the way, I think this is the problem. The Hispanic vote is caused now for the Democratic Party because culturally, a lot of Hispanics are a lot more moderate than the leading figures in the Democratic Party are on issues like sexuality and gender identity. And I think that's driven a lot of like sort of religiously devout Hispanics away from the Democratic Party is because they don't want to get into that like birthing person thing. They want to become, they're more moderate on those issues. And I think that's the problem with the Democratic Party is who do you try to appease? The activists, the very loud activists on the left, or sort of the core of the party, which are not the same thing sometimes.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you're going to be real surprised by this, but like let's imagine that you were supposed to be the party that did class solidarity and action, but you're scared to do so because you got bought off by corporatist Democrats and their neoliberal contributors. Then what you do is hope to find something that costs you almost nothing to make all your ethical energy go into, say, identity politics. And it works very effective to the people with money, namely white progressive people, because they give money because they are not connected to any historic religious tradition, which has a different way of thinking through and processing ethical decision making. And then let's say you are a historically oppressed group. In America, the idea that the dominant white logic is the one you're going to trust to figure out moral ethics is problematic. It doesn't take a long time through American history to go, what the really smart white people is not value neutral. They came up with all sorts of ways. Oh, you end slavery, but have you met Jim Crow? Here's Reconstruction. Like the leaders of culture and industry have consistently come up with new ways to feel ethical while preserving all sorts of oppression. So I'm not surprised that like Hispanic people of faith, black people of faith aren't interested in so like that turn to much more class issues seems logical, assuming you believed half of what your rhetoric was as a a well-to-do Democrat leader.
But the problem, the problem is the Republican Party will not let the Democrats brand themselves that way. The party of the middle class and the lower middle class. They want to make it about birthing persons and drag shows and all that other stuff because they know it activates a certain part of the electorate that should vote for Democrats economically, but don't because they don't like transgender stuff.
Yeah, the Democrats are much worse at winning. It's like they don't know it. They technically like science, but have they talked to psychologists about how you actually persuade people and build working majorities? No, because they're worried that their cousin is going to tweet negative things at them or something. Like it's kind of frustrating. But the other thing that comes up in that I'm interested in it is how does that growing religious divide in play out when and someone mentioned in the comments, like currently the leaders of the Democratic Party are, Pelosi and Biden, very old devout Catholics, right? The compromised right-wing religious leaders in the Supreme Court tend to be the Catholic ones. What is this weird function that a nation that for a long time was driven by Protestants and then evangelical Protestants, the way we sidestep dealing with the religion gap in both parties is attaching ourselves to the Democratic Catholics here and let Pelosi and Biden go, or the Democratic true free pro-life in scare quotes leaders. We aren't going to really put one of our firebrands. You know what I mean? Is that?
Yeah. I think one of the most interesting stories, and there's a political piece on this a couple weeks ago about Biden's weird relationship with the Catholic Church. He has a weird relationship with the Catholic Church, because he can't walk into any parish and get communion. I mean, there are parishes in Iowa who turn. Tom Vilsack, who is the Secretary of Agriculture, who's Catholic from Iowa. He was the governor of Iowa for a while. He actually walked into a Catholic church in 2004 and they turned their back on him. The congregation turned their back on him because of his views of abortion. I think that's one of those anecdotes that sticks in my mind forever about religion and politics and how they intersect with each other. But the thing is, the white Democrats are losing share big time in the Democratic Party. They're not. Most white Democrats are Republican. I'm sorry, most white Catholics are Republicans now, 55%, and it's trending that direction too. So in some ways, Biden and Pelosi are fossils of a bygone era of American Catholicism because it ain't like that anymore. Now it's just more and more Republican. They're not as Republican as white evangelicals are, but they're getting that direction. And the ones who are staying in the pews and going to mass every Sunday are becoming more and more politically conservative over time because that's what they're being fed from the bishops on down.
Yeah. It's really exciting there, Ryan. I just want you to know how much joy and anticipation and promise I feel for the next year while looking at these charts.
Data doesn't care how you feel. But, Tripp, this is a good one. This is a really good one, dude. This should make you feel better.
I'm about to feel better, and I hope everyone else is too. Share, who have no religious affiliation by education level, doing interviews for 20 Myths, which is an excellent book written by Ryan Burge, second edition.
Hey, look what I got right there. Buy you a copy.
Hold on. The video wasn't big then. You guys show it now.
But here, look. That's it right there. Hardcover.
Ooh.
Get you one. Yep.
And I often get asked, not me, Ryan, what's the biggest falsehood I see when it comes to data about religion? It's education leads people away from religion. 14 survey waves total in of 550,000.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
In every single survey, the less educated are more likely to be nuns.
Yep. Facts. Big facts, dude. This is something I swear to you, I can tweet this graph out once a week and it would still take off every week. And people will go, I didn't know that, every single week. It's this deeply held assumption we have about life is that religion and education are antithetical to each other. You get more educated and you become less religious. That's bunk, man. That is objectively wrong. And it's not just I'm massaging the data or trying to find one example of this. Every single survey, and I did another one below this where it was a survey of 477,000 people, including people with doctorate degrees, or 4,000 people with doctorate degrees in the sample. they're less likely to be nuns than those with a high school diploma. You know, the group that's the least likely to be nuns are people with master's degrees in this country. Like it is just objectively false that getting education like leads people away from religion. Now, when it comes to affiliation, people with higher levels of education are less likely to say they're nuns. Okay. B, when it comes to religious service attendance, more educated people are more likely to report attending services every week than people with a high school diploma or less. Now, the only thing where there's a caveat is that people with higher levels of education are less likely to say that God exists without any doubt. Okay. So they're more likely to express like an uncertain, oh, there it is right there. Like this is a huge survey too, 477,000 people. Look, 20% of people with master's degrees are nuns. It's 28% of high school graduates are nuns. 24% of people with doctoral degrees are nuns, which is the same level as those with a 4-year college degree. Like there's just no evidence in the data that like going to college or going to graduate school or even getting a doctorate like drives people away from faith. It actually might make them closer in terms of like a social thing. What I mean, going to church, being affiliated with religion. And I think that's just something we need to like dispel this idea that religion is for dumb, like uneducated, poor people. The data actually says it's the opposite. It's actually for educated, wealthy, or upper middle class people is what religion's, been about in this country. Oh. And I think that changes everything for a lot of people who are like, well, I went to college, I can't go to church anymore. I'm like, no, you should be, because other people are, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah. And and this was the other one I think that was in that Twitter thread was the church attendance by education level.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that came up when we talked about a similar thing before was what are the different variables that could drive this, and if part of what happens when you have a higher education level is you are more likely to have a set work schedule and could actually attend church.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if the biggest variable between those groups, idea-wise, isn't their actual ideas so much as how strongly they hold them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you get a pretty similar assessment of they affirm an ultimate reality, that there's moral, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
That they know for sure. Like, don't you think like successful 4-year college should just like let you know you shouldn't hold anything with complete certainty? Like, especially if you're talking about a universal, non-material source of existence that is does not really have the predications of all other existence things applied to it. Like that they aren't sure just seems honest. But
Yeah.
the bigger differences, I wonder if the bigger differences there are how their life is, what are the possible flows and rhythms of their life, and whether they make community possible. If that's a bigger change rather than the intellectual side, which is how both, I think, ardent secularization thesis are like education gets the God out of them, and then the right-wing conservatives are like education gets the God out of them, and then it doesn't. So I wonder if we have a bad idea about why people are actually religious and practice religious and attend things, if both sides have this myth of if we just give them the right ideas it works, and then it doesn't meet the story either side's telling.
So there's a research article published last year, I think, asked like what kind of degree you got. What they found was that people who went to like liberal arts, more like English, theology, history, things like that, were more likely to express uncertainty about God. And those who went into like engineering, science, those kind of things are more likely to express a certain belief either way about God. So I think there's a causal problem there, because the kind of person who goes into English is fundamentally a different kind of person than one who goes into engineering. Right. So I wonder if like the education is causing it, or just you have a predilection to a certain mindset and that leads you to a certain degree. You know what I mean?
Like if you're an engineer or a physicist
Yeah.
if you went through the big 5 psychological features, their bell curve is going to be much lower on the intense openness to new ideas, versus,
Yes.
oh, so you're doing a critical theory interpretation of early John Donne poems, and you're like, I know, isn't that awesome? And then they're like, how do you feel about polyamory? And you're like, I don't know, I'm interested. Not judging, just I haven't got there yet because I don't get married till I'm 36, and
And never have kids.
yeah, and then I never have kids, so it's less complicated. But you know what I mean? Like, I think there's a one of the things this data helps is it actually challenges the dominant story being told by to generate our tribal anxiety, right, on both sides. And anytime we can short circuit sweeping generalizations that turn the enemy into the enemy again, that's great. And then if we recognize one of the big variables might just be the impact of our economic system and what it makes possible for people to develop together in community and institutions, and so that's always a
can I
bonus.
make one quick point? That's what we'll be done with it. Is when people talk about religion, when I ask the question, "Are you religious?" What's the first thing that pops in most people's minds is they go, "God." What do I believe about God? Like that's what makes me religious. I wish I could change that default position, which is when I say, "Are you religious?" It's like, who do you associate with? Do you go to congregational worship? Like, to me, as a social scientist, that's actually way more important. Like, that kind of religion to me it's not what you believe about God. It's like we call it vertical versus horizontal, internal versus external, also is what's called. I think external religiosity is actually something that college educators will pick up on. Like the value of just being in a community of people that can help you when things are bad, and you can help them when they're in a bad spot. And just emotional support, relational support, all the things that you need. I think educated people realize because they trust the institution of college, and that's why they went to it. So I think a lot of this is institutional trust, is that low education people, we know this, by the way, empirically, people who have higher levels of education have higher interpersonal trust, which means that they ask the question, can most people be trusted or not? They would say yes. Low education are more likely to say people cannot be trusted. And so that kind of like mentality seeps into all levels of life, religion being part of that. And I can't go to church because I'm anti-institutional. And I think when you go to college, you realize, hey, institutions do suck, but they can be good. And they did teach me something. And I did, get a degree out of this. And I built friendships. And I built a network. You go, I'm going to transfer those same ideas to my local community and become part of a religious congregation and actually have really personal benefits out of that. Not just the vertical benefits, but also the economic benefits, the social benefits, the relational benefits. I think we need to talk about religion a lot more in that, that external way than the internal way. Because I think a lot of people would be more convinced by the argument I just gave you than the argument they're hearing from theologians, which is you got to get right with God thing.
Oh yeah. Ryan, have you ever had the idea of writing a book explaining the positive impact of religion on the public square and the well-being of the whole? Seems like a great thing. And if you use data to kind of lay out the case, I'm just saying, not a bad idea.
Tripp, thank you for giving me the opportunity to plug the fact that I work for a group called Faith Counts, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit, interdenominational group that their job is to show the benefits of religion in society. And so I'm making graphs and doing videos for them, basically kind of giving like 60-second explainer about this new piece just came out. I'll give you one example right now, Tripp. This research team looked at obituaries of people, over 1,000 obituaries of people, and classified them based on whether they talked about their religious congregation or not. And what they found was in the general sample, when religion was mentioned, the people lived 5 years longer than when religion was not mentioned. So, there's tons of data out there that says that being part of a religious community, whatever kind it is, right? Like, I don't even know, that's part of being about Faith Counts, which is great. I'm not saying come to my church. I'm saying go to a house of worship, synagogue, mosque, church. I don't care. There's actually a ton of pro-social and personal health benefits from being religious. And I think we don't talk about that. To me, that's the counter of Dawkins and Hitchens and Harris. It's not some sort of like teleological, epistemological argument about God. It's saying, hey, go to a service because it's going to make you live longer. It's going to make you happier. It's going to make you, less likely to get divorced. Like all these things that we want in the world is what religion provides, I think, for most people. Now, don't get it twisted. I'm not telling your LGBTQ folks to go to a church that tells them they're wrong. I am not saying that. I'm saying find a house of worship that affirms you in who you are and makes you feel like you're part of something larger than yourself. Whatever the tradition is, I literally do not care. But I think most people would benefit greatly by being part of a faith community in some way, shape, or form, especially as we've atomized as a culture. I think we need to hear more messages like that, because I think a lot of young people will go, yeah, I can not listen to Hitchens because I buy Ryan's argument. Like, that makes a lot more sense to me from a practical standpoint. I think that's the kind of argument the young people want to hear, and hopefully I can maybe make that argument somewhere at some point.
Yeah, yeah. I had this when I was in Edinburgh. We had a research seminar that was looking at a lot of this data, and it's always fun to watch a religion faculty respond to someone that's explaining like data on religion, because everyone has like wherever they come from that they then feel obligated to perform, and it is it was pretty amusing. This what was her name? She was a guest speaker, gives this paper, and one of the religious studies professors, who's like old school English raunchy atheist, like angry, likes to argue, and you're like, oh, here we go again.
Yeah.
Goes on some rant, and he's like, I don't go to church. I would never go to church, never take anyone to church or advocate taking them to a church, because I don't believe in child abuse or worshiping, going into this whole thing about how it's bad.
Yeah.
And the person, she responds, and she's like, now look, she's like, I'm a religious fictionalist. So my family are high practicing Anglicans. I just have no answer to any of the big questions. And I probably lean to agree with you, but the idea that a tenured person at a prestigious university does not go to a church, advocate people to go to a church, and insist that this church is really the only true church is odd, right? Like, the university is the only other medieval institution that still functions, gives you an identity, a path to success, means of interacting, a community, and then looks at the world and say, you should come join us and come here. Like, you want everyone to join this system where you are a sage. Like, in any normal sense, your vision of the world is better if more people are a part of the system you've given your life to. So for you, the university is religious. It is a religious institution, and it's older than most religious denominations. So, like, in some sense, you are just a fundamentalist conservative from the medieval period. And I just about lost it, because you can understand how, like, once you think about, if you aren't thinking about a particular version of a religion and that's the only one you get the benefits from, but that human beings, because we're story bearing and embodying creatures, work better when you have a story that you share, resonate with, and live into and out of, other than whatever story you have to tell yourself to, in your job or in, well, any of the other communities you get into. So I just thought that is fascinating, because I hadn't realized that a lot of the angry, ardent anti-religionists are in a very medieval institution and thrive there, and want everyone to spend thousands and thousands of dollars to make sure their kid gets indoctrinated.
But the problem with that institution is temporal, though. You can't stay there unless you're like me, like an idiot, and stay there forever. Most people don't stay there forever. They miss that. They leave that and miss that and go, how do I replicate that? And I'm like, there's literally a thing on your corner that could help replicate a version of that if you would just go to it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, you can build that, not at same level, but at different level of community. You can build that right where you are. And yet people go, well, I don't believe in God. And I go, I don't give a crap what you believe. Like, show up, for God's sakes. Like, be part of something bigger than yourself. That's something, like, you should go to church, has nothing to do with Jesus. Like, that's my whole thing. Like, you should go to church, has nothing to do with Jesus. Nothing. Now, if you pick up on the salvific ideas of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and I'm here for it. I think there's a lot of value in that theology. But if you don't, and you just go because you like the food and you like the hanging out with friends and you like to being part of something, oh God, who gives a crap? You know what I mean? I don't care.
Well, I want you to know that you may be the first American Baptist minister to give that invitation to the local community. They're like, Ryan Burge, American Baptist minister, invites
Mm.
everyone to go to his church or any other community where their identity is welcome and embraced. And yeah, so all right.
I'm giving a talk at the Unitarian Church this Sunday, by the way, to show you how like I practice what I preach here, Tripp. This is not just something I say on your podcast.
Oh, well, are you going to encourage them to have more children? Is that what you're doing?
They're a bunch of like 70-year-old people. They can't have any kids. Unitarians are dying off rapidly. There's like 250,000 of them in America right now. So
Well, just think. They're like the same size as what else is like 250,000? Like the
the
number of people.
population of Salt Lake City.
Oh, that's how big it is. I felt like it was bigger than 250. Anyway,
Salt Lake's not very big. Tulsa, Oklahoma is bigger than Salt Lake City.
well, and Tulsa goes on forever. I swear that. Anyway, but all right. Last question for you.
Yeah.
This is not a chart. Is going into this next year,
Yeah.
if we are hanging out at the beginning of 2024, what do you think the biggest story or two in American religion will be?
Oh God, Tripp. I think it's one thing we haven't talked about at all is the Southern Baptist Convention. Like they've hit like this kind of things have died down because they elected Bart Barber and he ended up being like a pretty good leader, more moderate. They're gonna have an election at some point and they're gonna try to elect a far right guy. If that happens, that's a big deal. Like like we're almost seeing like what we're seeing in Congress right now, the Republican Party, where you have like the big block of like sort of moderate-ish, I don't want to use that word, but less conservative people, and then like the 20 really crazy people. You got that in the Southern Baptist Convention, except it's not 20 versus 200. It's like 60-40 percentage-wise. That might tip. And if that tips, then the SBC becomes an entirely different institution. And, even though they're losing power and prestige, they still are the center pole of what evangelicalism is in this country. We got to keep in mind what's going on with that. The other thing is like, is the Republican Party going to figure out a way to be appealing to like libertarian nuns? Like they need to figure out a way forward with like, because like of Generation Z, like 45% of them are nuns now, for God's sakes. Like they got to figure out a way to like peel some of those people off into the GOP, or they're going to get their butts kicked in electoral politics for all of human history. So how is the GOP going to become a little less Christian nationalist and a little more like open to these libertarian minded, nuns? I think those are kind of the stories I'm thinking about a lot. But I'm also thinking about the Catholic Church, the continued split between like the trad Catholics, and like the more progressive Catholics. Like you're seeing a resurgence of the Latin Mass and all that pre-Vatican II crap. And then you're seeing, the trad Catholics kind of fight against the more progressive, like the Nancy Pelosi, Joe Biden Catholics. I think there's all these interesting stories, and they're all in my mind about polarization, right? About this faction wanting to go this way and this faction wanting to go the other way. I think it's so fascinating when you talk to a religious denomination that's declining. You can talk to two different factions. One says our problem is we're too conservative, and one is our problem is we're not conservative enough. You know what I mean? Like I think those are such interesting. Like SBC thinks about this stuff all the time. Catholic churches think about this stuff right now as well. I think those are fascinating questions. Is like how do you solve these problems of decline? And every religious organization in America is facing decline right now. I think how they chart a path forward to me tells me a lot about what American religion is going to be in like 20 years.
Yeah. It's here's a question that makes me think of, and I don't even know how. I don't know what I think about it yet. But do you think that the way in which you get this continued growth of people that are communally unaffiliated, then that it, even if the numbers drop percentage wise or numerically for committed religious people that are politically engaged, their power doesn't actually drop because people that aren't in community with shared narratives that animate action out of their deep convictions are like, what is their, like, if you were like, what is the exponential you had a lot more power exponentially when you have a shared narrative of meaning, purpose, value engaged in the world. And so the narrowing of the religious right and its increasing intensity, even though it's getting smaller, you could imagine a place where there just aren't community centers, the centers of community in the public place to rival the organization and time commitment, financial commitment of that group.
I'll give you a statistic right now. 118th Congress, right? Which is actually doesn't even exist technically right now, but let's say it does. 118th Congress. There are 2 religiously unaffiliated members of Congress. 2 out of 534 members, voting and non-voting members. In the American public, about 30% of all Americans are nuns. You know what I mean? So like the juxtaposition of this idea where it's like less than 0.5% of Congress are nuns when it's 30% of the population shows you the nuns are not a politically engaged, active force yet. 6% of Americans are atheists, okay? Half of atheists gave to a political campaign in 2020. Half. You know what it was amongst white evangelicals? 24%. But look who has more power in the political process. It's because white evangelicals have history. We cannot discount the history, but they also have institutions of power, and they have communication networks. They have all these activist networks inside that tradition that atheists, agnostics, and nothing in particular do not have. And I don't know, even if atheists participate at twice the level, if they can have twice the punch, you know, or even the same level of impact that white evangelicals do, just because of how historically we are in that, you know, they just run the show still. And I don't know how that changes. And by not joining institutions, I don't think you're losing power. You're not multiplying. You're doing less than multiplying. You're dividing your power. And I don't know how that. I always tell atheists all the time. I go, they act like I don't like them. I have no problem with it. Believe whatever you want to believe. I really don't care, honest to God. But at some point when my church closes down, which is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, we feed 225 kids a brown bag of food every weekend during the school year so they can have something to eat, Pop-Tarts and Capri Suns and apples and juice and things like that, okay? When my church goes away, is there an atheist organization going to step into the breach and give those 225 bags to those kids at the school? I've seen no evidence of them being able to do that on a scale that makes any sense to me. So if you can replace what church does, go ahead. But you've not shown me your ability to do that in the last 10 years. If you think you're growing and you've got money, which you obviously do, why are you not creating organizations and institutions that can actually do nonprofit and volunteer type work like religion's been doing for 200 or 300 years? If you can, I will gladly support you in your mission. But right now, they've not shown me any ability to do so. And I think that's bad. Politically, it's bad. Societally, it's bad. I think we need to think about that more as well as how do atheists organize?
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes sense. I have a few friends that are, which I don't know what you'd call them, like the equivalent of ministers to secular people, and try to organize community. And they, you know, used to be religious and then aren't, like, theologically. And they're like, it's really hard. And they come to you, they will go get a therapist, they'll donate to a campaign or whatever, but to actually like get together regularly to all that kind of stuff. It's funny when your former minister friends who are now intellectually an atheist are like, "Oh, I think life's so much better if you're religious." Just in listening to stories, and then I'm like, and then of course, like the data plays that out. You know, if religion's not a context of shame and harm, which is a congregation issue, not so much a religion in
Let
and
me
of
give you
itself.
one quick story, Tripp, and we'll be done. There's something called Sunday Assembly, which is basically a bunch of atheists decide we're going to have like church, like non-religious church, right? And they cropped up all over America, like in major metropolitan areas, Nashville and LA and Chicago, all had these Sunday assemblies. And basically it was like had the structure of a religious meeting. They had songs, but secular songs. They had a speech, but it was about like a motivational speech almost, but like, you know, non-religious, but motivational. Almost every one of them folded over the last couple of years. You know why? Because they were afraid to ask for donations because it made them seem too much like religion. That's the thing is, like, it's like a three-legged stool. Let's take one of the legs out and go, it'll be fine. No, religion exists because it's figured out how to sustain itself for 2,000 years, over 2,000 years. We know how to do religion, and you can't walk in and go, well, we don't need that piece of it, pull it away, and hope the stool still stands there. Right? That's like that story to me is telling me like why atheists can't figure it out, because they're trying to do the best parts of religion without the other parts that you need to do. They've got to get over the hump and say, all you got to say to the congregation is, I feel like a preacher like asking for money, but we need money to pay for the space and pay for the musicians and pay for the speakers. That's all we're going to pay for, and that's it. They can't even do that because they don't want to. They're so like allergic to the concept of religion. They don't want to do the things they need to do to keep their organization running. That sucks, man. Like that's bad.
But that issue, I think, is also there. Like one of the previous times you talked about how even the word Christian has become Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And so that leads to in religious communities that aren't Republican centered an unease just about being connected to that community and practice.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think of the kind of impact of removing more and more institutions where people find community, families find support. You have organizing for volunteering and giving and stuff. Like when the actual places that will show up and do that get narrower and narrower because to be in those communities is to be partisan on one side, then you worry about a deteriorating an already deteriorated public witness for the part of the church you and I are in. So
listen, I don't want to talk about my current situation. My church. Listen, Tripp, I want to be on the executive committee of the American Baptist Church, which is like the overarching like governing body of my denomination. When my church has 5 people in it, like what a weird world I live in, man. It's bizarre.
Yeah, it is. But
that's so mainline. By the way, that's so mainline, Tripp.
It is so mainline.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone that joined live, those listening later and such. I'm sure sooner than later I will have Ryan back on, and we'll talk about some more graphs and charts because I like talking to Ryan. That's why.
Can I plug?
Yes.
Okay. None second edition's coming out in May. It's longer. It's got like 25 more graphs. I just think it's a better book overall because, you write a book and you talk about a book for 2 years and you get better ideas. And so the better ideas are in the book. That comes out in May. I'm part of an effort for a book called The Great De-Churching, which is coming out in August. We did like 3 surveys, asked people why they left church, did machine learning on the data, trying to figure out why people left religion behind. It's a really good book, really data-driven. I'm the with author. I did all the data analysis. I wrote these little inset boxes inside that. So that's coming out in August. You can pre-order on Amazon right now, called The Great De-Churching. Michael Graham, Jim Davis, and myself. And then I work for an organization called Faith Counts, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, interdenominational organization that just tries to talk about the good parts of faith, generally speaking, in America. So we are launching a website for that in March, which is going to have videos from me, graphs from me, a lot of content from scholars about why faith counts in America and why we should continue to support faith organizations in this country.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to seeing all that comes out of your new work in the new year. And, when things are coming out, you got to tell me in advance so we can plan something, like when people can go get it. That way,
Well, I don't know. I'm not a capitalist, Tripp. I'm not a capitalist, Tripp. If you want to buy something, go ahead. I don't care. It doesn't bother me.
Well, I know you last time we got together, you talked about joining your union. This time, I think you demonstrated graphs that most of the problems of religion in America came in the 90s when class analysis left the heart of the Democratic Party. So, each time we get together, it's just a slow lure over here, right?
Hey, we might go on strike, Tripp, so that'll
Okay.
give me plenty of time to podcast, so I'll just let you know.
All right, that's what I'm talking about. Next time, maybe you start growing your beard out, and get yourself a just maybe like a little flower pin, a little socialist flower pin.
I'll hold my sign too, my strike sign.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, part of making jokes about it is it makes the serious witnessing when we're together in person eventually a little less threatening. You know,
I love it.
then I pull out a track, and
Is why you should be a democratic socialist track? Is that what it is?
yeah, well, it's yeah. I mean, look,
Okay.
the gospel takes different forms in different contexts. So
It does.
well, smoochy boochies.
That's a throwback.